Well, here at Holy Comforter St. Cyprian Parish in Washington, D.C., we are celebrating the year of the Eucharist, and we've got a lot of different activities, things that we're doing to really emphasize our love for the Lord in the Eucharist and to grow in our faith. Among the things we're doing, we're doing a series on Eucharistic miracles here online with some videos, and then also we're doing a series called the Mass in Slow Motion, because, of course, obviously the Eucharist, Jesus himself in the Eucharist is tied to the celebration of the sacred liturgy. And therefore, we wanted to take some time and really discover aspects of the sacred liturgy and kind of consider the Mass very slowly, step by step. So we're calling it the Mass in Slow Motion. And we want to look kind of really zero in. You know, there's a lot of things that go on at Mass that we hardly think about because they just go on all the time. You know, why does the priest walk an aisle? Why not just come right out? Or why does he have a special chair? Why not just sit where everybody else does? Or why does he kiss the altar? That's kind of strange. And what's the smoke? You know, what's that all about? So what we want to do is, again, take a look at some of the stuff that maybe we're familiar with, but so familiar that we hardly reflect on it. And if someone were to come in and say, well, that's weird, why did he do that? Would we have an answer? See? And there is an answer. So what we want to do is just take a little time and study the beautiful liturgies that we celebrate, their aspects, their components, and the different things that make up the Mass. So that's a quick introduction to the overall series, so that we can just grow in love and devotion to our celebration of the liturgy and to the fact that the Lord himself is the great high priest of every liturgy. Now, we're focusing on the Mass. There are other liturgies, like the liturgy of confession, the liturgy of baptism, and so on. But right now in this series, we're focusing specifically on the liturgy that we call the Holy Mass. Now, let's go right to the beginning then. In a way, a little before the beginning by most people's reckoning. I want to talk about the gathering rites. The beginning, how we come together and how we begin Mass. So the beginning or the initial rites, the gathering rites, I'm calling them here, and the Church often refers to them in this way too. So again, we begin the Mass by just noting the simple fact that before we can begin Mass, we all have to gather. And so many of you good people from the parish, you drive from different places, or some of you can walk to church, but we gather, we come into God's house, and we greet one another, and we sit down in the pew where we await, we're gathered, we're brought in. Hopefully you spend a little bit of time in prayer, preparing yourself as you're there, but we gather. Now, why is this? Well, again, first of all, because the Lord called us. It was not you who chose me, it was I who chose you. And therefore, again, if we come to Mass at all, it isn't so much that I'm going to just get this idea and go to Mass, but rather that the Lord is calling us. You know, there's an old Latin hymn that speaks about the gathering of God's people at Mass. It says in the Latin, Congregavit nos in unum Christi amor, which means that the love of Christ has gathered us together in one. Now, that means that we're the object, not the subject. So we are gathered. The Lord calls us. He brings us together. So never forget that, because that's part of your dignity and mine, that the Lord calls us to this sacred liturgy. He summons us. He gives us the grace and the strength. He speaks in our heart and says, come and worship the Father with me. Come, I'm the great bridegroom with the church. Come to the great wedding feast of the Lamb. All right? So as we gather in the church, we first acknowledge that we have been gathered, acted upon. We have been called, summoned, given the grace to come that morning. And what a grace, what a dignity. We would all be excited if, we had an invitation, say, to go to the White House or to some great gathering. We'd be just, wow, what an honor. Well, we got more than the president. Here, we've got the King of the universe. And not only that, he's going to put on priestly robes and he's going to minister to us. He's going to preach to us and feed us with his very body and blood and take care of us. What an honor. What a great, wonderful thing to be gathered together by the Lord. One of the Eucharistic prayers calls upon God to gather all your children scattered throughout the world. So the first step, it may be so obvious that we completely don't even think about it, that for Mass to begin, we first have to be there. Now, the Lord's always there, but he gathers us to join with him, all right? So that's, as you get in your car and come to Mass, Mass is already beginning in a certain prevenient sense. People are being brought together to worship God as one body in Christ. And also, I want you to think that we're being summoned to a celebration that's called in the Bible, in the book of Revelation, a number of places, like in the 17th chapter, and I should say the 19th chapter. It's called the wedding feast of the Lamb, that Christ, the groom, is with his bride, the church. There's that beautiful line about the great liturgy of heaven, that the church comes forth, beautiful as a bride, to meet her husband. And this beautiful example is given to us. So, we are now gathered. And somewhere up in the sacristy or in a remote room, other ministers are pulling things together. The priest is putting on vestments, and other ministers, for example, the servers or the lectors are gathering, and we're prepared. And once all is prepared, we go to the back of church, at least on a Sunday. And there's something remarkable here that I want you to think about. That once we're gathered, usually there's maybe a few announcements, and we may announce a hymn number or whatever, but those are kind of technical, logistical preliminaries. But at the end of the day, here's what's really happening. It's a wedding procession. Now, in our country, in American culture, and I suppose in many other parts of the world, it's the bride who makes the big entrance, But in many countries, especially in the ancient world, it was the groom who made the entrance. You may remember a parable that Jesus told about a wedding where there were 5 wise virgins and 5 foolish ones, and they were waiting for the groom to make his entrance. So the groom would make the great entrance and go into the wedding feast with all the guests. So that this is what we're celebrating in that opening procession. It's not just to get the priest and people up to the altar. It's not just a practical thing. It is that. But it's so much more. It's that the Christ, the great bridegroom of the church, is with his people. What an incredible thing. He's there. And again, let's just take, you're not welcoming Father Pope. That's nice. I thank you for welcoming me. But that's not why, you don't, everybody in the congregation stands as the entourage makes its way up the aisle. So the cross, if there's incense in the cross, and other servers, and the deacon with the book of Gospels, and finally the celebrant comes up the aisle. But it's Christ, the priest represents Christ, the great high priest, the true celebrant of every liturgy. He takes up the priest in holy orders, and in the liturgy he makes use of the priest, and not just like a puppet on strings, but he takes use of the priest's personality, his memories, his gifts, and his struggles. It's all there. But Christ takes up this priest and works and speaks and acts through him. So again, this is not some priest, some man walking up an aisle. This is Christ, the great groom, who is with his bride, the church. And so everybody sings, everybody stands and sings to welcome the great bridegroom. So that's what's going on. It isn't just, let's get a guy up there, and so let's get this thing underway. It's much more than that. Now, let's go back to a little bit of the history of this procession and the gathering rites. In the very earliest days of the church, Mass was celebrated secretly in the homes of the believers, usually larger homes. It wasn't around a dining room table. It wasn't informal. It was actually very formal. All the early documents we have indicate that it was quite formal. Women sat on one side, men on the other, the clergy in the front in a separate area, and this was very careful. These were larger homes of some of the wealthier Christians who would provide their homes for these liturgies that were more in hiding because of the persecutions for the first 330 years of the church's existence. Now, because of that, there probably wasn't need for a great procession. There wasn't usually. People were already there. They were gathered already, probably had some interactions, and everyone was properly seated, and the liturgy began. Usually went right to maybe an opening prayer and right to the liturgy of the word. So the idea of a procession and all was muted at this time because, again, of the need to keep the liturgies very compact in the homes of the believers. Now, they never called these house masses. These churches, these places where the Mass was celebrated was called the Domus, the house of the Lord, the Domus Domini, the house of the Lord. So don't just think, at your dining room table. We used to have these home masses back in the 70s and all, very, very common. But no, that's not what this was. It was formal, but there couldn't be time to do an entire procession. So generally, it would have just gone right to work. But now, once the church came out of persecution, they could build larger buildings. The church began to grow in size. Larger buildings often meant that the area where the priest and others would celebrate would be at some distance from the altar. There'd be some need for a procession. And as this entourage of clergy and other ministers, sacred ministers like servers and lectors and so on, would come up or enter into the building from maybe, say, an anteroom where they prepared, there would be a procession. Maybe it was short if it was a small church, or much longer. And some of these churches in the early days, after 330, after the Edict of Constantine, when the church could come out from hiding, some of these churches were rather large, and so it made sense that you wouldn't just march in silence. And so there came about the practice of singing while the entourage, including the priest, made the entrance up to the sanctuary. And at first, you just sang the psalms. There were no musical instruments like organ or other things. It was just a cappella singing. And there would be often antiphonal singing of psalms back and forth. And this would be led by certain song leaders, cantors, if you will, who would lead. But a lot of the congregation could also know the psalms and would join in. And so it was a kind of an antiphonal singing. Now, as things became a little bit more elaborated, they would then add something called an anaphon, like we do today with the responsorial psalm. And they would add this anaphon, which might have been a little simpler for the people to join in, and then cantors would sing the verses of the psalms, which people didn't always have memorized. And little by little, though, these anaphons became more and more elaborate, and it became harder and harder for the people to sing them. Little by little, the professionals took over, so to speak, and so a choir would often sing. But at first, it was a simple singing back and forth to welcome the great bridegroom Christ as he entered into communion with his bride, the church, and went up to the sanctuary. And what a beautiful image of this coming. Now, over the centuries, we have found that little by little, all the verses of the psalm became shorter and shorter, and the anaphon became longer and longer. And so that it was meant to cover the action of a procession, not to sing the whole psalm. So they might sing. So we eventually ended up with, say, about 700-800 years ago, that an anaphon would be sung on the way in, a verse of the psalm, and the glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, and then the anaphon would be sung again, and by that time the clergy and others would open the sanctuary, and they would then bring that to an end to signify that the procession was completed. Now again, here in modern times, because we wanted to bring people back more into the celebration of the liturgy more directly, there became the substitution of hymns that were familiar to people, that metrical hymns or songs that everybody knew that could sing as the procession took place. So today, there's at least 3 options to cover this action as the Christ, the great bridegroom, enters the church. One can sing the entrance anaphon, just as I said, the anaphon, a verse of the psalm, glory be, and back to the anaphon. One can also just sing a certain hymn that's appropriate to the Mass or the season. Or, in the absence of music altogether, the congregation can recite the entrance antiphon as the procession takes place. But some covering of this action with a celebratory word, sometimes at daily Mass especially, the psalm or the antiphon is just recited. And the processions are very short. There's a chapel or people are already up near the front. So you start to see there are different options. It's rare today, frankly, to hear the entrance antiphon sung with its psalm verse and glory be. I'd like to see more of it, but it is what it is. Today we tend to sing hymns that are familiar to God's people as the priest comes in. So, to review, the very beginning of Mass, even before the sign of the cross, there's a procession, there's a gathering, and then once all are in place, where Jesus says, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them, see? And so again, there's a gathering. And Christ then, of course, sure enough, because Christ says, wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I. There he is in the back of the church, working through the person of the priest, the human priest, but it's really Christ, the high priest, who's being, if you will, sacramentally imaged by the priest. He comes up the aisle like the bridegroom coming into a great wedding feast, which is what the Mass is, the great wedding feast of the Lamb and the great high sacrifice of Jesus, our great high priest. So all of these things are done as the priest comes up the aisle. The singing, the celebration isn't for Father Pope or any human being. It's all about Jesus. It's all about him. And once the procession is completed, we're going to pick up from there. There can be several different options. The altar will be reverenced, but then there might be incense, there might not. The priest will go to the chair, there'd be a greeting, but we're going to unpack that in a future series. So again, this is kind of what we hope to do with the Mass in slow motion, to just really drill down to the specifics and take a good look at these things that we do and say, wow, I never knew all that about that. But here's the takeaway I want you to remember. The congregation gathers, and Jesus, the great high priest, for wherever 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I in the midst of them. Jesus then comes among us, walking up the aisle like a great bridegroom coming into the wedding feast. And also the great high priest coming to offer sacrifice to the Father. And the congregation is excited and joyfully greeting him in the opening antiphon, hymn, or some musical element. Everybody stands and welcomes Christ, who is now present among us. So there we are. Step 1, at the beginning of the Mass, even before the sign of the cross, there is this procession. And what a beautiful and powerful moment to consider as we gather with Christ the Lord and our high priest.